Hello. Here we are in church, and I'm standing where I usually stand if I'm talking to you all. And there's something about this being Father's Day which kind of is appropriate when you consider that we're just getting ready to open the church again. And the last time there were a few of us gathered together was actually Mothering Sunday. So it just seems quite apt that both parents have had a look in at this time while the church has been shut. Now, it's really quite exciting about the fact that we're reopening the church. We know it's just for personal prayer. We know that it's still different. There's still a lot of rules, but it's really exciting. But when you put that into context, when you read when you listen to our reading today and you hear about everything that was happening in the beginning of Acts, wow, that was exciting. We read about how the disciples, after receiving the Spirit of God upon them, went into Jerusalem proclaiming everything, God's praises and all the wonderful things he'd done. We hear how Peter stood up and addressed the crowd. And in that first sermon and that first call to change your ways and turn to God, 3,000 people were baptised and joined the church. Golly, we wouldn't be just getting excited about opening this building for personal prayer. We'd be thinking, how will we get all of them into church? How will we organise services and rotas so that we could cope with that many people? We go on in Acts and we read about the miraculous healing of the crippled beggar. Now, I went to Sunday school, and so when I read this story, it just becomes the song, Peter and John went to pray, they met a lame man on the way. And even though in my head, as soon as I read the words, that's what starts, it doesn't make it any less wonderful and miraculous when you read about what actually happened. This miraculous healing, it provided so much opportunity for yet more testimony to God and the wonderful things that he can do. And there was a sermon right there as onlookers gathered, recognising this man that they knew as the beggar sitting there at the temple gates, and now he was up walking, and they could hear what God had done in his life. However, we read on at the beginning of chapter 4, not everyone was pleased by this event. We have the disciples going about doing what the Holy Spirit has enabled them to do. And when you think about it, they were actually just role modelling everything that they'd seen Jesus do while he was walking around and spending time with them. He was talking to people, witnessing, finding out what was going on in their lives, healing where it was needed. That's what the disciples are doing. But we have the black clouds of religious authority of the day gathering and getting nearer, and they are really just ready to rain on the disciples' parade. Our reading today starts with the arrival of a whole gang of religious leaders who were really worried by what Peter and John were saying. And they were so worried that they seized them both and shoved them in jail overnight whilst they thought about what they would do with them. Now, our Bible reading says that they went in jail because it was evening. There's the train just gone past for those of you that are used to that happening on a Sunday morning as well. I also think that maybe they put them in jail because they were thinking they'd had all day to work out what was happening with these people. Maybe they went out to see, was it really as awful or as bad as they thought? Were there lots of people listening and engaging with what was said, or was it just a few? I think that maybe seeing exactly how big the crowds were that were gathering, they went back to get reinforcements so that en masse they could go to tackle these two men. Now, it does seem a really heavy-handed approach for just two disciples that were talking to people. But they were there talking to the people that were gathering in the streets, in the outer parts of the temple, And they were sharing the good news about Jesus, the man who had died. Now that really is kind of the nub of the problem. Jesus didn't stay dead. He rose from the dead, and then on his ascension to heaven, he promised them more. He promised them the Holy Spirit. And this is what Peter and John were sharing about. And the trouble was that a lot of the religious leaders just couldn't cope with that because it was literally against their religion to believe in the resurrection from the dead. I think as well that maybe they were a bit more worried. They saw, as people were flocking towards this new religion, they saw that their own power, their influence, maybe even their income could be dwindling away. They needed to silence these two fast, and jail was probably the best place for them to start. I also think that maybe with the enthusiasm that Peter and John had at the time, jail wouldn't have been a worry. They really did have a captive audience to witness to. You can imagine them singing, praying, and talking to anyone who would listen. The guards were probably really fed up of them. And they were changing what could have been a very negative situation into a positive one. Now the next day dawned. Peter and John were brought out before a very select group of influential Jewish leaders. And this included Caiaphas. Now he had previous experience of Jesus and the stories about him because he was the high priest who questioned Jesus before he was handed over to Pilate. And Peter and John would have recognised him and remembered this, but it still didn't diminish their enthusiasm for faith in Jesus, not one bit. Filled with the Holy Spirit, Peter starts a speech. Now I just want to think about this and take a couple of things away from this reading today. I think that the first one is that night in jail. Now we hear other stories where men of faith are being held in prison and they use it as yet another opportunity to bear witness to Jesus and what he's done for them. And so I want us to be really heartened by this and try to change how we view things and our outlook on situations that we might find ourselves in, so that we don't see setbacks or problems, but just the opportunities that they bring. Mum sometimes moans about the number of cold callers that she's had on the phone during the day, and I tease her and say that she ought to be thanking them for phoning her, as she'd like to take the opportunity to talk to them about Jesus. I have tried it. It does shorten the call considerably, and you're not really being rude either. What an opportunity we've got there. That call, that conversation with somebody could start them on a completely different pathway through life. The second thing I want us to think about is the dramatic change that we see and read about today in Peter. When you read this passage, his confidence, the way he speaks, it's just amazing. Where is that fisherman who so many times got it wrong? He misunderstood things. He dithered in his face. Walking on water. He believed he could do it, then he took his eyes off Jesus and started sinking. And I think that just makes us think. Trust in Jesus and the gift of the Holy Spirit can really change your life around. I'm not saying it will always be easy. The Bible doesn't tell us that it will be easy. But there'll be times, problems will be surrounding us and you might be really struggling to see the opportunities that lie within them. But keep going. Keep the faith. Know that God will provide you with the strength to face whatever is troubling you. Let the Holy Spirit fill you and give you confidence as you step out, carrying out those opportunities that God puts in our path. So as we start to think about the church's opening, let us also think and consider all those opportunities that there have been for sharing the love of God during this time. think of all the stories that we'll be able to share with one another when we once again can gather back together. God bless.